For 2023, our bishop has offered us again to read the Bible through the year, and also readings from the Revised Common Lectionary for the special days and Sundays of the year. And I just thought I'd want to give something more about reading the Bible through the year. We should remember that the people of Jesus, that would be the Jews, and prior to that, all Israel, and I want to say even for the synagogue today, in my very limited experience of it, the synagogue has readings of God's law given to Moses. That would be what we call the first 5 books of the Bible, commonly referred to in our New Testament as the law of Moses, or the law God, I like to call it the law God gave to Moses. They read that 3 times a year, and what I mean by when they read it, they chant it aloud together 3 times a year. And the rest of the writings, that would be Psalms, Proverbs, the histories, the prophets, the divisions we have in our Old Testament we usually see listed, they would read all of those one time through a year. And by reading again, I mean they would chant it aloud together in unison. Now, my experience and what educators have told me is you say anything aloud 10 times and you have it memorized. So by the time someone is able to talk, chanting every Sabbath the whole of the law 3 times a year, well, by the time one is, say, 6 or 7, the law God gave to Moses would be memorized. And certainly by the time one is 10, all the writings in the prophets as well. So some people complain that we have so much scripture reading in our worship service. Well, it's not anything like what ancient peoples did. Well, I don't know about other ancient peoples, but certainly the Jews and Israel would have these readings, and everybody's chanting it aloud together. If you get to go to synagogue sometime, go and hear the Hebrew chanted in unison together. It moves fast. It's got a wonderful rhythm to it. And, of course, it's much quicker than our English translations. What translation did they use? Well, considering how old our Old Testament is, and considering the great, and that is number-wise, and the great number of years of the different scrolls that have survived, these are the ones that have survived. There are plenty others that have been destroyed. Some regimes in their tyranny over Israel had the scrolls burned. But the scrolls and the testimony we have of these ancient writings, considering how old they are and how many copies must have been made, there is very little variety, and the small variations that we have make very little difference in the overall meaning, none at all of the overall meaning. So they had it carefully recorded, and everybody had it memorized. So it's a wonderful unity. I can give you much more about our documentary evidence of the Old Testament. And the New as well is recorded in a briefer time, but in our Bible there is no other ancient literature that survives that is so well documented and attested to the accuracy in the way we have it. Just none other like it. Now, as to regard our English translations, the best translation is the one you will read. Any Bible you're not reading is of little help to you. I will continue with the English Standard Version of the Bible because I think it's a very accurate, faithful translation into English that is not usually idiomatic. That is, it's an English that is not limited to time, or the expression is not regional. It is very close to the received text that we have, both in meaning and word for word. And there are some modern translations that, for me to explain what's behind the text, would take more time in preaching. The English Standard Version of the Bible it is less necessary for me to explain what's behind the words. And it's one of those translations that, as I read it in English, I can sometimes pretty accurately in the Old Testament see how it would be in the Hebrew. It's that good. So, but the Bible you will read is the best translation. Now, about reading it through, there's several ways we could do this. The schedule that is published for us this year for 2023, there are 3 readings a day. And so they'll be briefer in each section. Please remember that the Bible is not in any way recorded according to in chronological order in time. I do think it is really helpful to know the context of the prophets, that is, the time period in which they're reading and the history that is going on around. And you can piece that together from hearing the persons that are talked about in the prophets, or what the prophet is saying is going on and about to happen, and putting that in context of the histories we find in particularly 1st and 2nd Kings, but also 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Also sometimes, not so much, but sometimes the books of Samuel. So anyway, we'll do this a little differently for 2023, and I hope you'll follow along. One other thing I guess I ought to say is why make the recordings for people to hear. Understand it's a very unusual thing and a very modern thing for each of us to have our own book and to read our own book silently to ourselves. Scrolls were not things that just anybody had. So while it's being chanted in unison, there'd be somebody leading the chant with a scroll, but everybody else would have the text memorized. They were a very literary people orally, very disciplined oral literary people, but it was written and everybody would chant in unison together. And God created everything by the spoken word. So I think there's something about speaking it aloud and hearing it. And if you're going to read it yourself, if you can, read it aloud to yourself. It means you're putting lips and tongue in action, and your ear is hearing it as well. It's a wonderful way of being able to memorize more quickly by reading aloud. It sticks in your memory, at least 2 different ways. If you write something out and you read as you write, if you're copying scripture and you're reading it and aloud as you're writing it, then it's getting into your very body and your mind at least 3 different ways. And ancient peoples did know how important this is, at least the Jews did. And there's no other ancient people that were so very careful to hand on their experience and their tradition and in actual history Other peoples, their gods were more of a mythology that stood out of time. The Jews and Israel, God had entered into time, their time and places, and of course, Jesus enters into history in the flesh. There is no make-believe land that our Bible is talking about. There are no fairy tales. This is God, the living God's act in history. So, yes, studying this in university, they may call this mythology. You can technically call it mythology, but it's a mythology like no other ancient people. And, of course, it is dealing with a living God, not cleverly devised myths. So I hope this is of help as we read together. Thank you very much. God bless.